Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in to a Wednesday night reading of Bloody Rose by author Nicholas Eames. This video is going to cover Chapter 5, Necessary Vices. Tam had been to the ravine once before, about a year ago. She'd been seeing an older girl named Roxa, who swung an axe for a band called Skybreaker, and had tagged along, without Tuck's knowledge, of course, when they auditioned for a big-time booker in search of new talent. A few hundred bystanders had been in attendance as Rox and her bandmates dispatched a sleuth of underfed bugbears, but the booker had left unimpressed. So too had Tam. She'd heard tales of the grand stadiums down south, like the Giant's Cradle, the Blood Maze of Oot, and the recently reconstructed Megathon, which was said to hover on tidal engines over the city of Fivecourt. By comparison, the ravine was little more than a glorified canyon. Her opinion changed the moment she stepped out of the Argosy. Uncle Bran had told her once that the arena could hold up to 50,000 souls, and she guessed it was over capacity today. Tam had never seen so many people in one place. The noise rolled and crashed between the steep canyon walls, which were riddled with cave mouths crowded with spectators. Higher up, daring Casker masons had hewn wide balconies of stone and timber that clung like fungal shelves to the sheer cliffs. Spanning the sky above those was a haphazard web of rope bridges and viewing platforms teeming with people pressed shoulder to shoulder and shouting at the top of their lungs. The mob surrounding the war wagon had been driven to frenzy by Fable's arrival. Everywhere Tam looked were ecstatic faces and waving arms. "Stay with me, Tam." Brune laid a hand on her shoulder, and they stepped into the throng. "Is it always like this?" she yelled over the din. "Pretty much." The shaman swiped his soiled hair aside and favored her with his gap-toothed grin. "Welcome to the jungle." The fights were already underway. Tam could hear the clang of metal on metal and see the occasional flash of spellcraft light the canyon walls. They skirted the sheer face of the northern bluff, escorted by 24 men bearing cudgels and round wooden shields. Roderick was out front in that silly hat of his, strutting like a noble's pet peacock. The booker led them into a tunnel that climbed and curved until it opened into an expansive and expensively furnished armory with a commanding view of the ravine. The place was bustling with bands, bookers, and bards. There was a bar near the entrance, and several games of cards or dice in session. Tam had expected to see mercenaries preparing for battle with focused calm, sharpening swords and polishing armor. Instead, she found a scene not unlike the Cornerstone Commons on any given night. Fighters awaiting their turn in the arena were stealing their nerves with liquor, while those who'd fought already were celebrating in kind. There was a broad window overlooking the ravine, beside which a ramp descended to the canyon floor. The band that had just finished fighting was slogging warily up it. Their leader wore a red cape and a comically large tricorn hat. He was limping on a bloodied leg, but smiling and waving enthusiastically at the crowd. The moment he entered the armory, however, he wheeled on the man behind him. "What the fuck was that? I told you to put those lizards to sleep." "I tried," said a harried-looking man in mud-drenched robes. He was holding a broken stick that might have once been a wand. "It's the crowd, Darren. They're too loud." "Too loud? It's a spell, you halfwit, not a fucking lullaby. And you call yourself a wizard. You couldn't turn ice into water on a hot day." He stopped to examine a pair of ghastly punctured wounds on his leg. "Does anyone know if slurks are poisonous?" "Only to assholes," said a woman stringing her bow nearby. "I'd start begging the maiden's mercy if I were you, Darren." The wizard chuckled at that, drawing a scowl from his injured frontman. The woman slipped her bow over one shoulder and pulled on a pair of mismatched silk gloves. The fingers of each were cut off at the knuckle. She wore a luxurious ermine-trimmed cloak over a rich-looking cotton tabard, a polished steel breastplate over a padded leather cuirass, and a blue silk surcoat under all that, which seemed to Tam like too many things to be wearing at once. When she caught sight of Fable, she grinned toothily. "Well, bugger me with the manticore's tail if it ain't little Rosie." Rose dragged a hand through her cropped red hair. "You do know I kill most people who call me that." Oh, but I ain't most people. The woman whose bow-legged saunter and backwater drawl were almost comically Carson slung an arm around Rosie's neck. Why, you and I are practically sisters, except your daddy's a good deal prettier than mine. Freezing hell, girl, I crossed half the world to rescue you and this handsome devil from the Heartwild Horde. She beamed up at the Druid. Hiya, Cloud. Hi, Jane. All you did was step through a portal, Rose said dryly, like every other Merc in Grangel. Fair point, but I did help old Gabe on his quest to reach you. My father said you robbed him. Twice. Jane shrugged. Builds character, getting robbed. Heck, if I hadn't... Boss, said a woman nearby who was also wearing armor on top of armor and two helmets at once. We're up next. Are we? Jane spun on her heel. Then let's show these northern louts how we do things down south, shall we? She stomped toward the ramp, forcing Darren to limp hastily out of her way. A dozen similarly overclothed women funneled out after her. Tam shot Kira a questioning look. Jane? The Inkwit scowled. What about her? As in Lady Jane? Leader of the Silk Arrows, first through the threshold at Kaldar? Kira barked a biting laugh. Girl, there ain't a Merc in Grangel doesn't claim they were the first to follow Golden Gabe through that portal. But yeah, that Lady Jane. She narrowed her eyes and bit her bottom lip. She's on the list, for sure. What list? The summoner arched a bone-pierced brow. The list of people I'd like to Tam! Uncle Bran nearly bowled her over with a slap on the back. His leathers were caked in mud, and there was an open gash below his left eye. So she guessed he and Ironclad, or the ragtag miscreants who called themselves Ironclad these days, had performed already. I can't believe it. What are you doing here? I mean, I know what you're doing here, but how did you convince Tuck to let you go? She glanced over at Kira, hesitant to mention how much yelling, crying, and eventually hugging had been involved. Long story, she said. Right. Well, you're here now, so it's... He trailed off when he saw the sealskin loot case on Tam's back. Is that your mother's loot? I figured Tam burnt the thing. I guess not, Tam said. Her uncle took a step back, and a wistful look stole over his face. Gods. You're the spitting image of Lily at your age. Except you've got your dad's height, obviously. And that go-fuck-yourself jaw of his. And his dirt brown hair. Heck, I suppose you got a fair bit of both of them in you. Kira snorted. That's the general idea. Bran scratched the gray stubble on his jowls as he examined the ink on the summoner's arms. I suppose it is. Say, is Roderick around? Try the bar, Kira suggested. I always do. I'll see you later. Bran staggered away, and Kira broke off to speak with a man in spiked armor who'd painted his face like a cat's, so Tam was left on her own. She wandered towards the window up front. She had it all to herself, since most folks in the armory were too busy plying themselves with liquor to take note of what was happening down in the arena. She watched Jane and the Silk Arrows swarm a Bandersnatch, which looked like a huge fluffy dog with bone-white fur and blood-red eyes. Its tongue lolled between fangs as long as Tam's arm, and whatever it touched sizzled as though the creature's saliva was highly corrosive. The beast's stubby, spiked tail wagged excitedly whenever it was about to attack, which made the Bandersnatch a fairly predictable adversary. A few of Jane's girls baited it with spears while the rest put a whole forest's worth of arrows into its hide. By the time they were finished, the thing looked like a spinster's pincushion. The Silk Arrows trotted back up the ramp to a thunderous applause. Up next were the Dusk Owls, who made short work of a Minotaur who tripped while charging them and broke its neck in the fall. The beast twitched and howled until one of the Mercs put it out of its misery. Then a pair of Wranglers came and dragged it off by the ankles. Giantsbane, who Tam had seen arrive alongside Fable the day before, had a bit of sport before their match. The arena gate opened, and the so-called cockatries Tam had seen in the monster market came squawking out. The mercenaries, whose pockets were no doubt stuffed with seed, pretended to run in fear while the chicken flapped in hot pursuit. Laughter cascaded down the canyon walls, though it ended abruptly when Alkane Tor dared to pick up the bird and get pecked in the eye. The Giant's Bane frontsman hurled the chicken down and stomped it to death, while the crowd cried foul. Afterward, they faced off against a quartet of scrawny trolls. Brannigan had told her once that trolls, which could regenerate lost limbs, were prized among arena wranglers. But Giant's Bane dismantled them so thoroughly that Tam suspected the poor bastards might not remember what parts went where when it came time to grow them back. While the renegades took on something that looked like a giant pissed-off cactus, Fable began preparing for the main event. Preparing, of course, being a relatively loose term in this case. Brune paced in circles, slugging a bottle of Aldean rum and whispering what sounded like self-assurances under his breath. Kira disappeared into an alcove with one of Jane's girls and returned a few minutes later with a pipe in her teeth and a languid smile on her lips. Free Cloud came to stand beside Tam at the window. He produced the moonstone coin he'd been toying with in the cornerstone the previous night and thumbed it idly as he watched the current battle unfold on the arena floor. Glancing past the Druid's shoulder, Tam saw Rose sitting by herself on a low sofa. She was wearing her scuffed black armor, and her scimitars, Thistle and Thorn, were in scabbards on either hip. There was an open satchel on the mercenary's lap, and for long seconds she stared down at it, flexing her fingers like a thief about to test a lock. Eventually, she withdrew a glossy black leaf and, with the grim resolve of someone determined to swallow poison, placed it on her tongue. Tam was about to ask Free Cloud what Rose was doing, but the Druid spoke up before she could. "We all have our rituals," he said, without taking his eyes off the action below. "Necessary vices that enable us to conquer our fear, or if not conquer it, then at least pile furniture against the door while we duck out of the back. It's not enough to survive what we do, Tam. We must also endure it." "What's the difference?" she asked. "One concerns the body, the other the mind. Every battle has a cost," he said quietly, "even the ones we win." Tam didn't fully understand what he meant, but decided to pretend she did, and nodded sagely. "So what's your vice?" she wondered. "Love," said Free Cloud, flashing a jaguar smile, "and I suspect one day it will kill me." The sun was sinking into the west as Rose led Fable into the ravine. Free Cloud was a few steps behind her, and Brune jogged after them both. The shaman was shirtless despite the cold, waving his arms and goading the crowd into a frenzy. His weapon, a double-bladed twin glaive he called Cthulhu, was leashed by a leather thong on his broad back. Tam had examined the polearm earlier. The two halves of the weapon were attached in the middle by a metal screw, which allowed the shaman to wield each separately if he wanted to. Kira brought up the rear at a walk. She wore a heavy black shawl and was unarmed, but for a trio of sheathed knives she claimed were merely part of her outfit. The Ink Witch didn't seem to care that 50,000 people were watching her every move. "Thrill him and kill him!" Roderick shouted after his charges, then bullied his way to join Tam at the window. The ledge was getting crowded now that Fable was taking the floor. "Is it true you don't know what they're fighting?" she asked the booker. Roderick was half a foot shorter than Tam, and was forced to nudge his hat from his eyes so that he could peer up at her. "I don't know," he admitted, "and I don't like it either. My contact here said he had something special in mind. Rose is going to love it," he said, and of course she went ahead and agreed to it. He pulled a long-stemmed pipe from his sash at his waist and began stuffing its bowl. "Sometimes I think that woman wants to die young," he muttered, and then fixed Tam with a sidelong glare. "Don't tell her I said so." Her Uncle Bran sidled up on her left with 2 tankards of beer. "Thanks," she said, wresting one from his grasp. What? Oh, yeah, sure," he grumbled. Somewhere a bell was tolling. Tam saw the portcullis in the opposite wall begin to grind open. As it did, those watching from the window, bridge, and balcony went as quiet as so many people possibly could. Whatever emerged from that gate would be the best Ardberg's huntsmen could manage, a monster they hoped was capable of challenging one of Granduel's greatest mercenary bands. Except it wasn't a monster at all. It was a man. One of the wranglers Tam had seen earlier, But now he was screaming and flailing. The stump of what had until recently been his right arm, he stumbled and fell, splashing helplessly in a pool of his own blood. Within seconds, the window was packed with mercs desperate to get a view of the arena floor. Roderick's hand froze in the act of striking a match. The flame sputtered out. His pipe fell clattering to the ledge before him. Something enormous ducked under the black iron portcullis. Its flesh was the sickly blue of moldy bread. Its gangly limbs were corded with muscles marred by welts and festering sores. It scooped up the thrashing groom and lobbed him against the wall. His body burst like a rotten orange, showering the balcony below with gore. The creature straightened, but its shoulders remained hunched, as though it had lived for years in cramped captivity. In darkness, too, Tam concluded, since a swollen black pupil filled the entirety of its single massive eye. "Fuck me with a Fantrin's salty dick," muttered Roderick. "It's a cyclops."